Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here with us tonight for our third lecture in the series. And thanks again to our sponsor, Wells Fargo Advisors, represented tonight by Kevin Loki. Where's Kevin? Oh, he's right back there. He was also one of our welcoming people. Tonight we welcome Guy Gugliotta to St. Simon's. During his career as a reporter, Guy covered some of the most interesting topics in recent history. After receiving a BA from Columbia College and an MA from Columbia University School of International Affairs, he began his career as a reporter with UPI. He then served as a foreign correspondent for the Miami Herald, reporting on Central America's guerrilla conflicts, Colombia's drug wars, and the Iran hostage crisis. For 16 years, Guy was a national reporter for the Washington Post, where he covered the Gulf War, the impeachment of President Clinton, and the Columbia Space Shuttle tragedy, among other topics. He received reporting prizes from Columbia University, the Overseas Press Club, and the Inter-American Press Association. Since going freelance in mid-2006, Guy has worked for the most part as a science journalist, writing for, among other publications, National Geographic, Smithsonian Magazine, Wired, The Atlantic, and the New York Times' Science Times. Since 2007, he has served as a judge for the American Association for the Advancement of Science Journalism Awards. Guy was also a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University and an Alicia Patterson Fellow. In 2014, he was selected for the first class of Science Journalism Fellows at the Santa Fe Institute. Guy's first book, Kings of Cocaine, documented the rise of the Colombian drug cartel. It was his second, very different book that brought Guy to my attention. While searching for information about Charles Cluskey, the Irish architect who was contractor for our lighthouse, I discovered references to Cluskey in Guy's 2012 award-winning book, Freedom's Cap, a history of the U.S. Capitol building expansion during the middle of the 19th century. I learned that Cluskey played a part in the fascinating story of clashing personalities before and during the Civil War. Tonight, Guy will share with us the history behind the project that gave us the magnificent structure we see today on Capitol Hill. Guy?
Thank you. I'm told that you all can hear me fine, even though it sounds to me like I'm just speaking in my normal voice. Can you all hear me? Yes. Excellent. I'm going to use this PowerPoint presentation to help me a little bit. And I'm beginning with an ad here for my book. You can buy it on Amazon, and there are plenty of copies available. There we go. This rather unpleasant-looking individual is a main character, one of the main characters of the book, and I'd like to read a short opening section just to sort of give you a picture of what life was like in Washington, D.C. in 1855, which is about the central year where Freedom's Cap took place. Army Captain Montgomery C. Meigs was not a timid man. Bearded and burly, he stood over 6 feet tall and weighed close to 200 pounds. Down-turned lips and a pair of dark, glittering eyes gave his broad face an intimidating, challenging cast. None of this was an illusion. Meigs, at 39, was just beginning to realize his potential, which was considerable. He was intelligent, ambitious, capable, imposing, and arrogant. He had graduated 5th in his class at West Point in 1836 and would have done better, he wrote later, but the commandant marked him down 100 points because, quote, I had many demerits. His mother had once described Meigs as, quote, high-tempered, unyielding, tyrannical towards his brothers, very persevering in pursuit of anything he wishes. That was when he was 6. Not much had changed. When he had arrived at his office in the U.S. Capitol building in January 11th, 1856, he had an awkward task to perform. Meigs was an engineer by profession, and on this Friday, he had served for nearly 3 years as superintendent in charge of transforming the cramped, crowded, and well-used U.S. Capitol building into a magisterial seat of government, with new marble wings for the Senate and House of Representatives, and a spectacular central dome made of cast iron. Late the previous fall, just before the snow started, his men had finished tearing down the Capitol's old wooden dome, a rotting, leaking, copper-sheathed fire hazard, and had covered the hole with a temporary roof, a wooden frame draped in waterproof canvas, kept the rotunda dry, and already the lawmakers, lobbyists, and hangers-on who thronged the building during the day had pretty much forgotten it was there. He had done all this quickly, and he thought elegantly. What he had done next, however, had never been tried before, as far as he knew, at least not on any kind of big building. From a base, on the floor of the Capitol Rotunda, he had erected a wooden tower made of 4 large timbers strapped together. It stretched upward through the center of the new roof and beyond. On top of the tower, the highest point in the city of Washington, he had mounted a derrick and a boom that was able to swing 360 degrees. When a multi-ton piece of cast iron was ready for installation, teamsters would put it in a wagon and bring it to the base of the building where it would be winched to the top of the new Senate wing. Then the new boom would drop a hook, grab the piece, lift it all the way up to the dome, and swing it around so the iron workers could easily bolt it into place. There would be no manhandling and virtually no need for scaffolding. The construction team would use a ladder to climb the tower and work from a catwalk below the boom. It wasn't even that complicated. Meigs, utterly certain of his technical brilliance, embraced his engineering challenges with joy. But in many ways, building the Capitol was a thankless job. Meigs had already spent significant time and talent dodging contractors' kickbacks, refusing employment to party hacks and thieves, lobbying Congress for extra money, and fending off political dust-ups. This year was shaping up to be even nastier. At least 100 of the 234 House members in the incoming Congress were know-nothings, anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant nativists who kept their affiliations secret from outsiders. They were going after Meigs for hiring foreigners, many of them Catholic, to paint the Capitol's murals, carve its stone, and design its ornaments. Meigs was a Democrat, and immigrants were an important Democratic constituency. But politics, if you were to ask him, had nothing to do with his hiring practices. Skilled stonemasons, artisans, and artists, many of them undesirables or fugitives from failed revolutions in France, Germany, and Italy, were washing up at U.S. ports by the shipload. Meigs wanted the best. The job deserved the best. He didn't care where the best came from, what language they spoke, or what God they worshiped. Immigration was a spigot that belched experts. He would have been a fool not to hire them. He had learned to ignore the political carping. Much harder to deal with was the tension over slavery. There was nothing Meigs could do about it. But the growing rancor was crippling the government. The wheels were turning ever more slowly, and Meigs, who needed new money every year to continue building the Capitol, had to have a Congress that was willing to act on his legislation. But right now, it was impossible to get Congress to act on anything. President Franklin Pierce, a Democrat, had submitted his annual message to Congress, but the new House had refused to let it be formally read or debated until a speaker was elected, and the failure to do this for 100 ballots and counting was because different factions distrusted the aspirants' positions on slavery. Pierce's message talked a lot about foreign affairs, but most of what he said was shadowed by the slavery question. There was a dispute with Great Britain over possible Isthmian canal routes across Central America, where Southerners were hoping to create a new slave state. The previous year, U.S. diplomats had called on Spain to sell Cuba to the United States and threatened to take Cuba by force if Spain refused. The idea, once again, was to make Cuba a slave state. Closer to home, in the western reaches of the Louisiana Purchase, rival gangs of pro-slavery and abolitionist thugs have been dueling for almost 2 years over the future, slave or free, of what would come to be called Bleeding Kansas. There was no resolution in sight, and with a speakerless House, the government had all but ground to a halt. Meigs had his own views about slavery. Although he had been born in Augusta, Georgia, his mother had forced his father to move back to Philadelphia because she could not stand the idea of raising her family in a slave state. On the other hand, Meigs was a good Democrat, and Democrats, especially Southern Democrats, were slavery's biggest supporters. Ultimately, however, Meigs did not have to have an opinion about slavery. As an Army officer, he was never asked for one, and he never offered one. More important, keeping quiet was critical for Meigs because his boss was Secretary of War Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. Everybody knew Davis as a formidable public figure, one of the most outspoken slavery and states' rights advocates in Washington. What everybody had not known, at least at first, was he was also the political guiding spirit of the Capitol Project, a role he had assumed as a senator when it was launched in 1850 and had eagerly resumed as a member of Pierce's cabinet. Davis had hired Meigs in 1853 and had supported him unfailingly in making elaborate changes in the new Capitol's design, in planning the sumptuous decor that Meigs wanted for the new wings, and in substituting more durable and more expensive materials everywhere in construction. Meigs wanted the Capitol to last. So did Davis. Davis was not only Meigs's mentor, but also, as Meigs said in his diary, quote, my superior and my friend. When Meigs finalized his plan for building the dome with a boom derrick, he had described the apparatus in numbing detail in a long letter to Davis, probably because he knew that Davis, who like Meigs loved gadgets and innovation, would read every word. The previous day, Meigs and his family had eaten supper at the Davis home. Anyone who opposed Davis took a risk. He was an eloquent, even an inspiring advocate. In private, he was an intimidating infighter, a feuder and grudge holder capable of towering rages. He was a loyal ally, but a vicious enemy. Meigs, who had never experienced the bad Davis, knew he could not have had a finer protector, but he also knew he had to keep the faith. Once a person got on Davis' bad side, he seldom got off. Worrying about Davis is what had brought Meigs to the task he was currently trying to deal with. 2 months earlier, he had received a letter and a photograph from Thomas Crawford, an American sculptor based in Rome. The photograph depicted the statue of a woman. Crawford called her Freedom, triumphant in war and peace. And she was absolutely exquisite. An elegantly draped, quote, light and beautiful figure, Meigs wrote in his diary. She was to be placed atop the new dome, with the new dome. Freedom would stand literally at the pinnacle of American democracy. Meigs needed to have Davis approve the design. The statue was not the hard part. Davis, like Meigs, was a cultured man. How could he not like the statue? The problem, Meigs knew, was the narrow, floppy cloth hat that Freedom wore. It was a liberty cap, the symbol from classic antiquity of a manumitted slave, which had been revived during the American and French Revolutions. Davis did not like liberty caps. He had made that clear some time ago. Liberty caps had little meaning in the United States, Davis had told Meigs. Quote, he says it is the sign of a freedman, close quote, Meigs wrote in his diary, quote, and that we were always free, not freedmen, not slaves just released. If Meigs agreed with this bit of oblique sophistry, he left no record of it, nor did he comment on, or apparently even think about what could become a much larger and potentially far more incendiary problem. The irony of using a free slave as the symbol of liberty in a nation that was holding 4 million people in bondage. Meigs was smitten with the statue, as he wrote in his diary, but pessimistic about its future. Freedom, he noted in his diary, had the inevitable liberty cap, to which Mr. Davis will, I do not doubt, object. Now he was sending Davis the photograph. He had tactfully made his own position clear in an accompanying note without mentioning the liberty cap. The statue's, quote, strongly marked lines and shadows, he had said, quote, will, I think, give it a striking effect even at the height of 300 feet at which it is to stand. He handed the envelope to a messenger. So, it turns out that there were 3 designs for freedom. One on the left is the first one. Meigs contracted with the sculptor in Rome to make it, and the sculptor Crawford had the tremendous skill of being very fast. Meigs liked fast. He liked people who worked fast, and he demanded speed and attention to detail. Crawford sent this model, the one you see on your left, and Meigs loved it. Davis loved it. What Meigs needed, though, was a pedestal, a larger pedestal to put on top of the dome. So he sent the design back to Crawford and said, this is great, but give freedom a pedestal. So this is what came. This is the one we were just talking about. Nice pedestal. Nice liberty cap. Not a whole lot in common with the first one. So in doing the research for this book, I wondered why it was that Crawford didn't follow instructions. And I am unable to come to a conclusion, but I have an idea. Meigs, one of his chief personal failings, in my opinion, and believe me, I suffered from it, was that he had handwriting that was absolutely unreadable. And he loved Crawford, and so he would write these long, long letters to Crawford, and at first he'd start off and you could just sort of see him sort of biting his tongue, you know, for the first 3 paragraphs. That's pretty nice, you know. Then by the 4th or 5th paragraph, forget it. You know, you couldn't read anything. And then he'd go on for 5, 6, 7, 14 pages writing stuff to Crawford. So you can picture Crawford in Rome, right? He's sitting around with all the expat Americans in the city, and they're all sort of sitting around drinking wine, scratching their heads, and trying to read what in God's name that he was saying. And so he said, well, I'll just do my thing. And so he did it. And Meigs was right. Davis hated it. So that went away. And then this is what we got. This is freedom, the one that is actually on the Capitol today. So Crawford got rid of the liberty cap, and he sent a letter to Meigs that what he wanted to do was to stress a theme from the American past, and he wanted an Indian motif. Meigs was not really enthusiastic about this. Crawford was from the Bronx, and he had never seen an Indian in his life. And this was quite apparent with earlier designs that he had done, so much so that Meigs on several occasions begged him to go down to the Vatican Library or to go to the U.S. ambassador's house, where they had books that had pictures of Indians, you know, so look at them, you know, look at them, see what they look like. Well, this is what we got, okay. So you see, he's got this nice sort of fringed Pocahontas sort of skirt here. But as we move up, it becomes more and more Greek draperies and stuff till we get here with this very classical face, and, you know, above the waist, she's pretty much a Greek statue, except she's got this unbelievable headdress up here. And I don't know if you can see this, but that's supposed to be an eagle. And so here's this poor woman with an eagle sitting on her head, and worse than that, the eagle looks like a rooster with its mouth open. I'm not a fan, but that's what we have. So, this is what the Capitol looked like in 1850. It is, in fact, the central section of the current Capitol. And it's pretty much intact, except for the dome in the middle, which of course has been changed. But the front is this is the eastern front, is pretty much the same today as it was in 1850. There were problems with this, and it's here that I have this crib sheet because I found out that Charles Kluski was from St. Simons, or had worked in St. Simons Island. And so it turns out that Charles Kluski had been hired by the House of Representatives to do the final, analysis of what was wrong with the Capitol in 1849. So he says it much more eloquently than I could. This edifice, which should compare with any other of like character in the world, and which I have examined in every particular, is in many respects very defective, and its general condition is very bad. It will require not only considerable repairs to protect it from dilapidation, but such improvements as in heating and ventilation as will render it more healthy and better adapted to the purposes for which it is intended. He talked about the stone facade, which is made of sandstone. It's still intact, and it's still intact, I think, largely because Congress managed to take Kluski's advice. He told the Congress that the sandstone on the front, on the facade, absorbed water and eventually would just molder away and die if it wasn't painted on a regular basis, painted with oil-based paint. And it is indeed painted every 10 years with oil-based paint, and it still survives. Plaster falling down in the ceiling. You're walking along the corridors in the eastern side, and all the blam, something falls down. Then, as now, this is the north side, this is the Senate, and this is the House of Representatives. And that is true today, and it was true in 1850. There's broken stone lying all over the place, Kluski says. Woods rotting everywhere. Copper in the dome is bad. There are all these cowls, these sort of metal covers over all the chimneys that are up on top, and they're all sort of turned in different ways. And while he was up there looking at them, he saw a fire ignite right on top of the Capitol. There's trash everywhere, in corners, up on the roof. Pieces have been taken away. Items have been taken away, moved from one place to another. Nothing done about it. And the air's bad. The walkways are made out of brick. The brick falls apart inside over the course of the year. In dry weather, there's dust that everybody chokes on. In wet weather, it's real slushy along the passageways. Everything needs to be painted. Fixtures all need to be changed. So it's a mess. How much of a mess? This is the old House of Representatives. It's now called Statuary Hall for those of you who have visited the Capitol. And it is, for the pages and the guides that take people around the Capitol, they love to have people stand in the middle and then speak in a normal voice and have them be heard, like way over here, if you're standing in the middle, or way over here. The trouble is, if you're sitting in the audience here in 1850 and somebody's in the well speaking, you can't hear a thing he's saying. And it's just bedlam. And so it's so bad that one architect who wanted to do the job suggested that the reason that the Democrats and, well, the Southerners and the Northerners were at each other's throats, particularly in the House of Representatives all the time, was that they couldn't hear each other except by walking right up, straight up to somebody and screaming in their face. And this, of course, was not a friendly thing to do, and this was the reason why the country was going to fall apart, because lawmakers couldn't understand each other. And it's true. There are transcriptions of debates in which the reporter who's taking notes in shorthand, he says, he's got parentheses, can't understand a thing that's being said. And then he goes, and Mr. So-and-so stands up and he says, I couldn't understand that. And then somebody else stands up and says, say, I'd like to vote on that lighthouse down in St. Louis. We're not talking about that. I said, what are we talking about? I don't know. And this goes on and on and on. It's just absolutely chaos. So let me come to the Senate. Senate's much nicer. It's, people can be heard. It's very elegant. If you've ever been to the Capitol today, the Congress has put this chamber back into the way it was in 1850. It looks just like this. And if senators want to take a secret vote, they'll often go in here and lock the door and do it. The thing about the Senate was that in the United States in 1850, there was no Major League Baseball, no NBA, no cable TV, nothing. And people didn't have, the only hero in the United States was George Washington. And people lived fairly isolated existence, even though that was changing. One thing people did know about were the senators. The most famous people in the United States in 1850 were Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Thomas Hart Benton, later Jefferson Davis. And these folks, because they were there, and the reporters would take their would make their transcripts and then send them off, and they would be reprinted verbatim in newspapers. Some newspapers actually were founded, in effect, to transcribe the debates in Congress, committee meetings, and so forth. These people, the senators, the US senators were the rock stars of the 1850s. They had the highest profile of anybody in the United States. So they were a huge tourist attraction. And as you can see, there was this sort of makeshift gallery, because this was not planned at first, but it held about 200 people. And it would be filled every time that there was a debate of consequence in the Senate. And senators had a habit, when not everybody was around, of sort of sending a page up to talk to particularly attractive women and have them come down and sit in the chamber while the debates were going on. And but there were problems with the Senate. The Senate was really hard used. It was much too hot in the summer and much too cold in the winter. In the winter, the senators would wrap themselves up in blankets and sit and have themselves sit and do things like whittle. They would whittle, or they would frank letters, or they would read their correspondence, or do all kinds of things just to keep warm. Or they'd walk back and forth in front of the in front of the desks, because there were two stoves on either side of the place. It was nasty. And the other thing that every foreign visitor mentioned, that this was a real attractive very attractive room, except for one thing. Everybody in the U.S. Senate chewed tobacco. And Charles Dickens once said, if you drop your purse, he said, don't pick it up unless you're wearing gloves. So the place was a mess. So then we're going to talk about why the United States wanted a new capital. Washington was not very popular with the people that worked there. Most congressmen and senators came for the session, which usually began in December and ended in March. Then they went home as rapidly as possible. Very few of them lived in Washington. They stayed in boarding houses and bailed as soon as the session ended. But a couple of things had happened. In 1848, the United States signed a treaty with Mexico and got about 1/3 of its territory. The next year, gold was discovered in California. 90,000 people were in California by 1850. California had to become a state right now. There wasn't enough room. Senators all worked at their desks. They had no offices. There were committee rooms sort of spilling out everywhere. There weren't enough committee rooms for people. New states were being created all the time, and they were adding, and seats were being added, and there was no place to put anybody. It needed to get bigger. That was one reason. The second reason, though, was more interesting, and that brings us to Jefferson Davis. He was the chief driver of expanding the Capitol. And his basic reason was, well, he said the House absolutely had to have a new chamber because nobody could hear anything there. And there wasn't any room because there was going to be too many states. But the chief reason that the United States needed a new capital was because a great nation needed a great seat of government. And he said this flatly. This was not a particularly popular point of view when the first appropriation was being undertaken. But this is something that he believed. And this is a very unusual statement. It's not an unusual statement, probably not an unusual statement today, but coming from him in 1850, it was fairly extraordinary. Because during 1850, beginning in February, the US Congress and the US Senate in particular was debating what to do with the territory of Mexico, what states were going to be slave, how they were going to divide it up, what they were going to do. The country was balanced. It had a certain number of slave states, a certain number of free states, and now California had to become a state. And it was doubtful that that was going to be a slave state, so if that wasn't going to happen, what were they going to do? So they began a whole negotiation that lasted for about 8 or 9 months, which ended in what is commonly called either the Compromise of 1850 or the Great Compromise. So Davis, very early in this debate, staked out a position as one of the leading advocates of slavery and states' rights. And it was a position that he never wavered from, and it's a position that he held up until the day he left Washington in January of 1861. At the same time, however, he was the chief advocate and the chief spokesman for expanding the national government, making the national government a beautiful place, making Washington, D.C. a beautiful place. Washington, D.C. didn't have any congressmen, didn't have any senators. Nobody cared about Washington. There was no constituents there. And but he cared. He was on the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution, which was founded in 1848. And during the debate on whether to fund this, he wanted $1 million, $500,000 for the House and $500,000 for the Senate. And they said, and so his colleagues were arguing with him. He says, this is just the tip of the iceberg. You have to get $500,000 isn't going to get you anything. And he says, we know that all you want to do is get this money so that you can get more money and more money. And so Davis started off and says, no, this is just to do the facade. This is just to do this. And then he stopped and he said, listen, he said, I don't know if it's going to cost $2 million or $1 million. I don't know. It could cost $2 million. It could cost $10 million. It costs whatever it costs. Because I can tell you that this nation, if it stays together, he said, what this nation is going to be is that in 60 or 70 years, there's going to be buildings that we own all over this hill, all over Capitol Hill, which is in fact the case today. So he never seemed to have a problem with this problem. States' rights and slavery, strong national government. On the other side, he juggled these positions for the entire 10 years that this job took place. And I am at a loss as to figure out exactly why it is. I'll say one thing, though. He was in the military, a West Point graduate. And he had lived away from home in Mississippi for most of his life. He had been to Oklahoma, he had been to Minnesota, he'd gone to school in New York, he had been to Washington before, he had lived in Kentucky. He'd been in a number of places. And in my experience, it's folks from the armed forces tend to have a national vision much more developed than a guy who's a farmer who spends all his life in Vermont, or who never goes away from Philadelphia. So he had a concept of how great or how large the United States could be, and he embraced it, even as he tried, or he was an advocate for what ultimately he hoped would destroy it. And this is the great irony of this whole story, because as the Capitol goes up, the symbol of modern democracy, the nation is going straight down the tubes and into the Civil War, the biggest conflict of all time, of our history. So he got moderate funding, and then he held a contest to see who was going to be the architect of the Capitol. And this gentleman is Thomas U. Walter, who eventually won not this competition, but a second competition. So Davis held a competition, and the big thing was whether to build new wings on either side of the Capitol, obviously the solution which won, or to build a new building or put an extension on the eastern side, which is the side that faces the parking lot or the commercial thoroughfare, not the side that falls off the hill. So the competition was the House wanted to build the northern addition, the eastern addition, and Davis wanted to build wings. Davis won, but he didn't really win. He was called away to Mississippi. He had to make an emergency run for governor because the Democratic candidate had imploded, and his party implored him to leave Congress and to go and to run for governor. He lost, but not by much. So the competition was taken over by President Millard Fillmore, and an odd fellow from New York who had been an indentured servant as a kid. So Fillmore invited all of the 5 or 6 architects to come in and present their plans, either wings designs or eastern extension designs. And they all came and would argue about this for hours and hours and hours. And Most of what we know about what took place in these meetings, we know because of Charles Kluske, who was indeed one of the 4 or 5 major architects who was involved in this particular thing. And in 1855, he sued, or he sent a petition to Congress saying that the design for the dome and the basic design for the Capitol was his, and he should be paid for it, and he'd been ripped off. This was sort of sour grapes. He did get ripped off, I mean, to a certain extent, but everybody did. The peculiar thing about this contest, as Kluske makes clear, is that what Fillmore told everybody was, you know, you submit your designs, we'll give a prize and everything, but what happens is that if your design is given some money, it's not necessarily going to be your design that will do this. We'll take ideas from your design, we'll take ideas from somebody else's design, and ideas from this design or that design. So this is sort of, you couldn't win in this. That's the thing. And so they would have meetings. They started off, Fillmore called like a 3 or 4 hour meeting, and as Kluske relates it, all of these guys came in and they were supposed to take turns presenting their plan. So somebody would come out and say, well, this is my plan, this is blah, 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 blah. And all the other guys said, oh, that's awful. You know, that's just terrible. And they just chop it to bits. And the next guy would stand up and say, oh, that's terrible. Everybody would say. So they could agree on nothing. And, but somehow what Fillmore did was he for some reason, he liked Walter. And so he hired Walter. He didn't hire Walter right away. But all of the drawings would go to Walter, and Walter would make the composites and bring them in and show them around. And so after 2 or 3 sessions of this, everybody got the idea, you know, that Walter was the chosen person. So here he is. Walter at the time was in his mid-40s. He was at the top of his profession, such as it was. Architecture was not a particularly esteemed profession at this time. Most of the people who were involved in it had started off either as draftsmen, mechanical drawers, or in the building trades. Walter was from Philadelphia. His father was a bricklayer and owned a brickyard, and he knew all the building trades. He had apprenticed and then partnered his father for several years. Then he had gone off to school and had learned how to become an architect, and had been extremely successful. And he was very wealthy at the time he was picked. He had a contract to do the Customs House in San Francisco, California, another nice plum assignment. He had built a harbor for the Venezuelan government in La Guaira, below Caracas. And he had built a whole college in Philadelphia. He was from Philadelphia. So he had all the credentials, and so he took the job. And he was given the job in June. And things went well. What happens, as I sort of explained earlier, is that Congress would come in and they'd work they'd come in December and work until March when they appropriated all the money. Then they'd all go home. And they wouldn't come back again until December. This was good for Walter, as Walter got his appointment in early June, so he had a whole 6 or 7 months to get it going without people breathing down his neck. And believe me, the whole story of this from here on out is people breathing down his neck and everybody else's neck to see what was going on and to make sure that it all went well. So this is what the Capitol looked like, I think, probably just around the time that Franklin Pierce came in to take office, about 1853, 1852, 1853. what you see here is they've begun these two enormous excavations over here to build the foundation. These are granite blocks, which will be the foundation along with bricks, and they're sunk in the ground like that. You've got trash and junk all over the place. You remember the earlier picture with the nice trees and everything. Forget that. That's over with. Is it? Now you've got a big mess here, and so Congress comes back for Pierce's inauguration. And they see all this stuff, and they say, "Oh boy, this is not so hot," and so they don't like it. And it's noisy, it's messy. They get mud on their feet, all kinds of stuff, and all kinds of bad things. And then at the end of 1851, the Library of Congress almost burns down, and it's not Walter's fault. And he rebuilds it beautifully with cast iron to make it fireproof. But it stops the work on the bigger project pretty much cold, and it loses funding. And then it gains funding, and then people start accusing him, people in Congress start accusing him of playing favorites, of doing shoddy work and all this stuff. And the reason they do this is because this is the biggest thing going on in Washington. Walter, in digging this foundation, had 800 people working for him. This was the biggest job in town. And so the patronage potential for this was enormous. And every congressman sees this and sees, here's an opportunity for me to get my hands in this. And so how do I do this? I got to appoint my favorite architect or my favorite guy to do this. And the way I do that is by discrediting Walter. So Walter is like fighting like crazy to keep his job. Then Pierce comes in, and appoints Davis to be his Secretary of War. So all of a sudden, Davis is back, and Davis takes a look around, and he decides to appoint this gentleman, Captain Montgomery Meigs of the Army Corps of Engineers. He's going to be the guy that's going to be in charge. And Walter's going to work for him as the architect and his second in command. This is a great bureaucratic move because it takes the job out of the hands of the civilian and puts it in the hands of the armed forces. And if somebody has a complaint about how Meigs is doing the job, Meigs says, I really sympathize with you. You're absolutely right, and I really take your advice under advisement. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell the Secretary of War, who's my boss, and we'll see what he says. And he always said the same thing, and he always told these folks, get off my guy's back, take a walk, take a hike. We're going to do it my way, or we're going to do it this way, and this is how it's going to look. In 1854, Walter drew this picture. This was a color picture. All we have are photographs. This picture has disappeared. It was 7.5 feet long, and he put it up. He put it up in the lobby on the house side near where the architect's office was. And he tacked it up on the wall, and he did it at the beginning of December in 1854, so that all the lawmakers, when they would come back to go into the session, would see, wow, that looks great. And so that there was a certain amount of cynicism about it, and like, why should we invest all this money? But Walter had designed this dome here, and he decided to make this glorious poster. And he was very smart. You can see these pictures of these very elegant people walking along here with the carriages and so forth, and all of this. Those were the lawmakers, you see. He said, you're in Congress. If you're in Congress, you can work here. You'll be here. So they walked past this and said, God, this is terrific. And this is really wonderful. That dome, it looks great, because the dome's really big, and Congress loves big stuff. And said, this is really big. This looks great. And Meg said, well, we got a little ways to go before we do that. And they say, well, why not do it now? And so Meg said, well, God, give me the money, I'll do it. And so they weren't ready, but they got the money. And so they started the dome project. And at this time, throughout the first part of the project, Meigs had the degree from the military academy. He was a licensed engineer, and he was in the Army Corps of Engineers, which had great respect in the United States at this time. These guys were the best of the best. Walter, of course, had come out as, like many architects, had come out of the building trades. So he was seen as sort of lower class to Meigs, particularly Davis. Davis hated Walter, and he loved Meigs. And Meigs was younger. He was about 35. Walter and Davis were just about the same age. And Meigs and Walter got along great for 3 or 4 years. And then I think they started to, Meigs started to get jealous of Walter when he saw this. And because the facade was Walter's, this, and this, and Meigs had been trying to make all kinds of modifications and handled all the decorations inside and stuff like this. And then in 1854, Walter comes up with this, and Meigs knows right away he's been trumped. I mean, that's it. And this is what the Capitol's going to look like, and it's going to be Walter's design. And so the jealousy, I think, starts there. And Walter was at first very sort of deferential to Meigs, in part because of Davis being in the background, but he begins to get sort of chapped off too because Meigs is not treating him very well. So Meigs, as I say, handled the decorations. This is Constantino Brumidi. He's Italian, trained in the Vatican, an immigrant, a revolutionary who got washed up on these shores. The know-nothings hated him. And, but he was an expert in decorative design, fresco painting, which the United States had none of this. And he was given the job of decorating the building. And he used a Pompeian style, very fancy. And you can see it all over the Capitol today. These are what are called the Brumidi corridors. And the tile is British and ordered up by Meigs. And the tile is dyed, it's colored not just on the surface, but down into the tile itself. So it lasts a long time. And the design was made by Brumidi. Brumidi actually framed all of these designs and he painted these, but he framed a lot of them, and people have been working on these even today to finish them up. But what these are is these arches are illusions, and what he's done 2 dimensions and made them look like 3, and he was fabulous at doing this, and he could do whole rooms, one of which we will see, where everything you saw practically was an optical illusion. And so the other thing, so Meigs, as I read in the prologue, loved gadgets, and he loved modern stuff. And so one day he decides, and he went for the high end every time, so that he didn't want wooden window frames. He wanted cast iron frames. He didn't want manila window sash cords. He wanted wire sash cords. So he invited Roebling, this guy that was this Swiss immigrant that was making wire rope in Trenton, New Jersey. He invited Roebling's representative in to show him samples of sash cords that he would use for the windows. This guy opens this big catalog, and Meg sees not only do they have sash cords, they got hawsers like this. And so he gets this idea. If I order up 3 big hawsers from Roebling's factory, and I sink them in the ground, attach them to these big concrete blocks and sink them deep into the ground, and I run this mast up to them, then I can have this boom and I can swirl it around 360 degrees, and I can build the dome of cast iron without ever having any scaffolding. I can do it without scaffolding. What I'll do is I'll run this pillar right up through the bottom of the rotunda. It'll get to the top, and I'll have a little platform. You can't see it here because it's level with the roof. But I'll have a little platform here, and as we build the dome, as each layer builds, we'll just winch the platform a little higher, and a little higher, and a little higher. And we're always going to be pulling the cast iron up, and we're going to be setting it in place right there. Half the labor, and well, actually, he actually calculated it. It was less than, it took 95% less time to do it this way than to haul the stuff up on scaffolding. And that way we can finish this in a very elegant fashion. He loved this. And the thing is that this is the same principle that is used in skyscrapers today. And I don't know if it had ever been done before. I can find no record of it. But it was a tremendous innovation and tremendously labor-saving. This is another thing that Meigs did. He was a member of something called the Saturday Club, which was run by Joseph Henry, the original founder, the original president of the Smithsonian Institution. Every Saturday night, Henry would invite very well-respected science people to come in and see a presentation from somebody, and just to chat with one another. One night, Meigs went, and a photographer made a presentation on colloid photography, which has just replaced daguerreotype. Colloid photography enabled you to make negatives and on glass. I'm sure that many of you have seen glass negatives. So he took a look at this, and this huge light bulb flashed over his head. And he said, Walter had something like 15 draftsmen working for him. Anybody who ran one of the shops or who was doing a job and wanted to do it, needed a drawing of the job, would go to Walter, and Walter would have one of the draftsmen make a copy or do a copy of something. Well, I got this. I make a negative. Everybody on the crew can have a copy. And so industrial photography in the United States begins with this job. And these are some of the intricate drawings that Walter had made. These are, whoops, sorry. These are the uprights that hold the dome in place. And this is the colonnade that goes around the dome. And if you were up close, you could see all the tiny little measurements and everything. I mean, they're exquisitely drawn. And he could make a dozen of these and hand them to everybody in the business. Another thing he also found was that he began having his photographer take pictures of the project as it evolved. He had all these pictures. He would make little sheafs of pictures and hand them to Jefferson Davis or hand them to Senator Douglas, or hand them to all of these senators and congressmen, influential people, as souvenirs. And great PR. They loved it. They loved it. They're getting a nice big pamphlet full of photographs. It's, oh, that's marvelous, just marvelous. And he said, yeah, well, that's what it's supposed to be. And so just about this time, and I think we're talking now about 1858, Walter and Meigs had their final falling out. Walter found out that Meigs had taken some of his early drawings of the Capitol and had written on them, had changed the provenance of them, so it appeared as if Meigs had participated in the drawings when he really hadn't. So Walter was furious at this, and he accused Meigs of stealing his work, or trying to take credit for his work. Meigs, by contrast, at this point, Pierce was gone, and now Buchanan had come in, and Meigs accused Walter in turn of trying to take his job back. In other words, trying to get Meigs ousted. Meigs didn't get along with Buchanan at all. And so you had one guy saying that the other guy was stealing his designs, and the other guy saying that the other guy was trying to get him fired. Well, both guys were right. And Meigs was stealing the designs, or not stealing the designs, but was putting his signature on designs that had not had his signature on them. And Walter was indeed working furiously to get Meigs fired. And so the new house opens up, and this is a page from one of the leading weekly newspapers in Washington, D.C. And I have it here for two reasons. This is in February of 1858, I believe. And it's during a debate that had something peripherally to do with slavery and ended up in a huge brawl. So the message there is that it wasn't the acoustics. And the second thing is you see that you can see the new Capitol here. The new Capitol is the logo for the paper, except you can't see what the hell's going on with the dome. The reason you can't see what's going on with the dome is that Walter took his drawings, moved his office out of the Capitol to another place, and refused to give Meigs the drawings. So construction stopped. And construction stopped because Meigs said that he was in charge of the project. He deserved to have the drawings. He wanted the drawings. And so when he went to complain about this to Buchanan, Buchanan's people said, you know, he said, request the drawings and you'll get them. He says, I'm not requesting anything. They're mine. And so Walter, of course, didn't give him anything. And so everything stopped. So that when Lincoln comes in as president and gives his speech, he gives it, and there are pictures of this. I don't have one, but you can see the construction, and because there is no dome when he gives his first inauguration speech. So this is 1859. This is the Senate, the new Senate, which was completed and inaugurated then. The reason I have this photograph here is that if you've ever visited the Capitol and sat in the gallery, you'll see that it's exactly the same as it is here. And the desks are all very old, and have people's names carved in them from 100 years ago. And so that if somebody comes, a senator from Georgia, he will sit at Senator from Georgia's desk that's been for the senators from Georgia forever. And so this And the well looks exactly the same, and they've even tried, and they even have matched this original carpet, which was blue with gold insets. Whoops. Okay, now this is what I was talking. This is called the President's Room, and this is just off the Senate floor, and it was built so that when the final rush to complete legislation came at the end of a session, the president would come over to the President's Room and sit there and sign legislation as it arrived to him. This is this is my favorite Brumidi room, and all of this is all optical illusion, and you go into this place, and it just leaps out at you. I mean, it's more is more. I mean, it's really something, and it's just splendid, and there are two or three other rooms like it in the Capitol, but this to me is the best. So Walter wins the battle. Meigs gets so furious with the Buchanan administration, not over the Capitol, but over another project that he's doing, a bank building, that he speaks out of turn, and the Buchanan administration kicks him out and sends him to the far Tortugas, to this fort just off the coast of Florida near Key West, and which is the end of the earth. And so they put another guy in charge. Well, Meigs goes, but he says, he thinks to himself, he says, it won't be for long. This guy's not going to last. That is to say, Buchanan. And he was right about that. Anyway, Walter takes over, and when freedom finally comes, he realizes that the statue is so big. This freedom of what Meigs wanted was something about 17 feet tall. What he got was the freedom as we know her today is 19 and a half feet tall. That Walter decided he had to lower the dome, and this is the drawing that he made for it. And I included this because it's so elegant, and you can actually see how it works, in that you have an inner dome here, and then the outer dome, which is this is the cast iron, and this is what you see from the outside, is here. And then this is a cast iron eggshell, sort of a half semicircle. And Brumidi draws his famous Apotheosis of Washington mural in here, but it hangs by a chain above this opening in the inner dome. And what happens is that Walter put mirrors around here in these windows so that the light would come in and shine straight up at the mural all the time. People standing in the rotunda and looking up would have and do have no idea that there's a hole here, that there's an opening here. So it is a grand optical illusion. This also illustrates what to me was one of the most fascinating things that I didn't understand about this when I first started this project, but one of the things that absolutely fascinated me is that the dome of the U.S. Capitol, made of cast iron, is like a gigantic teacup. It has no structural function. It's just sitting there. And the idea was to mount it in such a way that it would look great from the outside, look great with the inner dome from the inside, and last forever, and still not be a structural part of the Capitol. And I thought it succeeded marvelously, and I just included this picture because I like it so much. So the Civil War begins, and you have a tremendous problem. Washington sits between Virginia and Maryland, and Virginia is part of the Confederacy, and Maryland is basically garrisoned so that it wouldn't become a part of the Confederacy. And so Washington needs troops. And the war begins. Washington's got no troops, and there's the standing army, or not standing army, but there's the Army of Northern Virginia is pretty much right outside the gates. And so the Lincoln brings in a whole bunch of troops, and they get to Baltimore, and a riot stops the train, so they have to march from Baltimore into D.C. But there's a problem. In D.C., there's no garrison for troops. There's no place for them to stay. So folks that are still in Washington are really happy to see the troops. They open up the Capitol. And for the first 6 months of the war, the Capitol Rotunda served as a barracks for the Union Army. Now you can see here, let me point out a couple of things. You can see the riser here you can see the hint of the stairway going up. This is the pillar in the center of the rotunda that they were building the dome from. And you see is that all of these guys sitting around, and they loved putting ropes around these uprights and swinging across the dome back and forth. Union soldiers went into the Senate, found Jefferson Davis's desk, and started to chop it up, and they stopped that. And they finally got the troops out after about 6 months when Congress came in for a special session in July. Thank God, because the Capitol was going straight down the tubes. The Army of the Potomac had its kitchen in the basement, and soot and stuff was going into the Library of Congress, and it was quite a mess. So anyway, this is as I was talking before. The war ends, and Brumidi finishes up the dome. The dome was finished when Walter, with Brumidi doing the decoration, Walter's the architect, finished at the end of 1865, same year the war ended. And this is two views. This is the close-up view. This is the apotheosis of Washington. I don't know how to pronounce that word. And there's Washington, and who, as I say, is still the only hero that the United States can agree on at this point. And this is the view. This is what it looks like from the rotunda as you look up. And this is the first row of windows, but there's this other row of windows right up here that nobody in the rotunda can see. Anyway, so I'm happy to take your questions. This is what the Capitol looks like today, with the visitor center down here. These are the two wings connected, and the new dome. And happy to take questions. My problem is I can't see, so there.
How did you get interested in this particular building and get so involved?
I covered Congress for the better part of 10 years in the 1990s. I'd never been in the Capitol before then. I was working for the Washington Post. The Washington Post had a satellite office in the Capitol, so I didn't even have to go into the paper. I'd just go to the Capitol and work. And And I love the place. I mean, I came in and every painting on the wall was a postage stamp from my youth. You know, it was and I thought to myself, gee, it's just like a stamp I have. And I realized that that's the original, you know. And it's there. I used to prowl the building all the time. And there were 4 floors. You can't do that anymore because of 9/11. But back then, you could just go any place you wanted, and it was really, really interesting. And so I read, or I heard that the new architect of the Capitol at that point, this was in 1998, was planning on doing rehabbing the dome, which had a bunch of leaks, cracks, a whole bunch of problems. And I thought, well, this would be a really interesting story to figure out how they do it. And so I went and I reported the story, and it was fascinating. And the story ran on the front page. And I thought, and everybody thought, that the project was going to begin about around 2000 or a little afterwards. But then 9/11 happened, and then all the money went into building the visitor center. And it's only now, oddly enough, that they're doing the rehab of the dome. They started in 2011 and, 2013, I guess. And they're going to be working on it for another 10 years, I believe. And yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Did our Charles Klusky, who designed our cottage here, have anything to do with this? Because I thought I had read somewhere that he received this commission because of his participation in the Capitol. That Walter was the architect of record, but I didn't realize we had 5, for competition.
That's a difficult. Indeed, he had a lot to do with my book. I can tell you that because.
I read that it's the colonnade, that first in the windows. What his name?
Well, that's what he says, and what here's what he said in his petition when he was suing for having his design ripped off. Anyway, he says that the dome is no good, which is true, and the existing dome at that time is no good, and what you should have is a cast iron. What you should have is a cast iron dome. This was in his report of 1848. The current dome is just a stopgap. I would therefore recommend the substitution of a colonnade of 30 columns made of cast iron resting on the third blocking course, supporting an entablature, blah, blah, blah. And that was written in 1848. Now, the colonnade is 36 columns, but what actually happened was that Walter, and you can see from his correspondence, has this idea in 1854 and sends a letter to this friend of his in Philadelphia and says, I have this idea. And the thing is, it's St. Paul's Cathedral was sort of the basic inspiration for this, and because Walter had visited. Did he read this report? I doubt that. I think he may have heard about. He had done the library in cast iron, and he had. And he knew that the Capitol needed a bigger dome because it was going to be a much bigger building. And he had been the compiler of everybody else's drawings and stuff. So yeah, I mean, Klusky certainly made a contribution, but I don't think, just on the strength of this, simply because he said it ought to have a colonnade in 1848, that he should have credit for the colonnade. He certainly thought so because he said so in his petition to Congress. And again, yes, yes, right there.
How old was the building when Klusky did his first analysis of it, and how old was it then?
well, the building opened theoretically in 1800. It was started in 1792. But the building, as we saw it, oops. Well, forget that. I mean, once you go through it, you can't go back. But as we saw it, the building as we saw it in that original picture was complete in 1832. And it had been worked on principally by 3 different architects. The last one was a very Boston Brahmin type guy named Bulfinch, who had finished the rotunda and had finished what was then the library in the back, which is these terraces that fall down and on the western side. But nothing had been done between 1832 and 1851. So it's 18 years where everything just sort of started to get a little bit older and a little bit seedier and a little bit grimmer. And as I say, nobody cared, nobody in Congress really cared about doing anything for Washington because there were no votes there. And so they just sort of, they neglected it. There's no two ways about it. Yes?
Can you comment on a story that I heard that inside the chamber, if one congressman or something's on one side and one's on the other, and he whispers, somehow if it goes over the other side, he can hear it or something?
Sure. Yeah, and tours that go through the Statuary Hall, which was the old House of Representatives, they love to do that. They'll have somebody stand in the middle and say something like whisper, and then somebody over in the corner will be able to hear them. And but this, which is very amusing today, was the source of people tearing their hair out in 1850, because you could that phenomena existed. So some lobbyist would be talking about twisting the arm of some congressman to get him to fund some program of his, and everybody on the other side of the room could hear this taking place. Then somebody would be making a speech and screaming at the top of his lungs, and the people sitting where you are couldn't hear a word that I'd be saying. And so it was, huh? Yeah, it's because it was a domed ceiling, and it was absolutely chaotic. They entertained the idea of putting a glass ceiling on top of it to do something there. They actually reversed the seating one time because they thought that if they reversed the seating and put curtains behind the speaker's podium, that everybody would hear better. That didn't work. And then they also toyed with the idea of putting in a glass shield, and like a murder trial in Europe, and but that didn't work either. And so by the time even long before Kluski wrote in 1848, people had determined that the House of Representatives was just absolutely a disaster and beyond fixing, and so it had to be. They had to have a new building. Thanks very much.